Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel, and today we're going to be talking about the 7th episode of The Acolyte, or the penultimate episode of The Acolyte before the finale that we get next week. And I've been very much up and down on this show. I feel like I've liked it more than most people, but as we're reaching the end of the series, and as I said at the very beginning in my first couple videos on the series, is that it really does rely on how this series ends. If it does not land well by the end of it, I do think that everything else that comes beforehand might fall apart. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing a little bit of that come to pass in this episode, and that mainly stems from the structure of this show, which I do think is very flawed, which I'll get into here in the rest of this video. But there is also a lot to enjoy about this episode as well. I did still enjoy, for the most part, the ride that this show has brought me on. So we're going to be talking about this episode in full spoilers. This is the episode that tells you what happened on Brendok 16 years ago. The episode that we've been waiting for ever since really the beginning of the show, to really figure out what happened all these years ago. What was the inciting incident? What's caused all the events of this series to take place? And we get all of those answers and more in this episode. So let's just jump right into this thing. So let's switch it up. Let's start off with my negatives for this episode first. And it's not necessarily for this episode. I think it's for the series at large. And that is, like I said, the structure of this show. And I mentioned, I think, 2 videos ago, which is my issues with May and Osha as characters, which I honestly think that these characters are more interesting when they're children than when they are, grown up, when they are adults. And I think that mainly is because we really haven't seen a lot of Amandla Stenberg in this show. And I do think that they are phenomenal actors. And I do think that the scenes that we do get of Amandla doing their thing, as Osha or as May, and whenever, you're having Osha interact with Kamir, especially in the last episode, there's a lot of great stuff with these characters and how they can play around in that role in those specific scenes. But for the most part, we got the first 2 episodes, which, it held their backstories up, completely. We didn't know their backstories whatsoever. And then episode 3, we didn't get to see Amandla Stenberg. We got to see the younger version of these characters. We got to see the backstory for Osha's character. And then we went to episode 4 and 5, which, to be quite honest, I do think that 4 really didn't have much at all. And episode 5 was the big action sequence, which again, you don't really get much at all because it was the big action sequence. And then last episode was also another build-up episode where you had the big payoff in episode 5, and then you're building up the characters once again. But again, all these secrets are still being held to the point where now we're in the second to last episode, and we're finally getting some motivation, or I guess maybe a little bit of motivation for May and why these characters did what they did and why the Jedi did what they did in all this story. And so when you really add it up, we pretty much really have just maybe 3 episodes worth of development for those characters in this 8-episode season. And I think that is my main issue with this show. And I do think that, quite frankly, if this entire backstory was sprinkled throughout the entirety of the series instead of just in episode 3 and then now here in episode 7, I do think it would have landed better. And to be quite honest, I've had similar struggles with myself as a writer when it comes to some of my film classes that I had when I was in film school. And, one particular writing class that I had this, short film script that I was working on that I really do enjoy. I had a lot of fun writing it. And, the first time I presented it to the class and we read it all out loud, my script was not in chronological order. It kind of bounced around between different timelines. And, my biggest complaint that people had in that class was just put it in chronological order, because then things will just, flow a lot better. Things will make a lot more sense. People were confused. And I was like, no, I really like the idea of having a non-linear structure in this story, because I think that those reveals happening at a certain point in time lead to the most dramatic effect possible. But again, that led to a lot of confusion, a lot of waiting around for these answers, and by the end of it, it just felt a little bit underwhelming. And when I finally did, let go of my script ideas, and I, gave in to the criticisms that people were having, and I put it in chronological order, it worked so much better, because when you follow these characters in the order of events that they are, and you develop these ideas and their story leading into all the decisions that they make later on, it just works better. And that's not to say that non-linear storytelling can never work in any shows or any movies whatsoever. I think that it works a lot of the time. I just think that this story in particular that we've been told for the Acolyte, I think could have severely been improved if this storyline was, if these secrets were not kept as at an arm's length as it was in this show. Because it's not the fact that it's, big reveals of like who a Sith Lord character is. I think that is a thing that you do want to kind of hold off on, for, a reveal in episode 5. I think that is a good idea. That is a secret that you want to hold on to. I think that there are some ideas of why did they cover it up? Like, what is all this stuff? That is a good idea to, keep as a secret. I think the questions that the show is asking about, what did these Jedi do on Brendok that was so wrong? I think that is a great question to ask yourself for the mystery for the entirety of the season. But I think what is wrong questions to ask for a season like this is, what are the motivations for the characters? Why do they make the decisions that they make? What is their character development? What is their motivations? And in particular with May, why does May want to kill everyone? Knowing that May saw a Jedi kill her mother is important to know her motivations. Which Jedi killed her mother is a better question to ask. If we heard May tell Osha that a Jedi killed her mother, I don't think that would have ruined the mystery of who it was or why it happened in this episode. It would have made their motivations make much more sense throughout the entirety of the season up until this point. It's a character beats in this show that have been held as secrets instead of it being progressing it as time went on. I think that is a fatal flaw of this show. But I'll get into the actual specifics of what was revealed in this episode in a second here, but in general, just generally speaking, as an overall blanket over this episode, I do think that none of the reveals here were necessarily surprising, because the entire time, ever since the first episode, or the first 2 episodes, that the Jedi did something wrong in these events on Brundok 16 years ago. That's not a secret. That's something that we were very clearly telegraphed from the very beginning, and once we do get those answers here, it still feels like, yes, this is the episode where you learn everything, you get to learn all this information, but I still feel like I didn't really learn anything new because none of it was all that surprising. So I think that they really wanted to make a mystery show. They wanted to do something in a non-linear storytelling way. They wanted to do a Rashomon type of thing where you get to see the same events from different perspectives. But I think that somebody along the path should just, told them to stop and say, why do you need to keep these certain things a secret? And what makes this even more clear to me is the fact that, this episode is once again directed by Kogonada, and it feels like they were definitely given episodes where like, okay, Kogonada, you're going to direct these episodes with this younger cast. You're not going to deal with anybody from the current, timeline. This is all entirely you. You are developing this entire backstory solely by yourself. And when you have like a show like Lost, for instance, which had flashbacks in every single episode where you get to learn more about each character as the series went on, you had different directors on all these episodes, and they got to play in these different timelines, and you didn't have one person in general be in charge of the entire backstory. And so that just makes it clear that the show is always meant to be structured in this way, that Kogonada was going to be the only person that's going to be dealing with all this backstory stuff. And so, yeah, sure, you could have done in post-production, you could have edited it all together, but then you can't say that this episode was directed by one singular person, because it technically wasn't, if all the flashbacks were directed by Kogonada. So again, I do think that all this was intentional. I just think that someone along the process should have said, maybe let's just play it all in order, and maybe it'll just flow better for the audiences and for everybody, and these reveals would make a stronger meaning at least. So let's get into the actual episode itself and to the specifics of what is revealed in this episode, which again was that the Jedi made mistakes, but also so did the witches. We get to start off with why the Jedi were on this planet in the first place, and it's because they're searching for a vergence in the Force. This is a planet that had gone through some celestial event where, life was essentially taken out of this planet entirely, and after a few short decades, which was a lot shorter of a time span than you would normally see a planet, regain life, you got to see this planet sprout with life and trees and all these different things, and it felt very strange. And the Jedi in general sent a team to investigate what happened, what made this all happen, because it feels like something that would be a vergence in the Force, that something caused life to sprout on this planet once again. That feels very unnatural, so that is why they're here to investigate. They've been here for 7 months, and you have, the Torbin character is very much tired of being here. He's an annoying, Padawan character that's complaining about, being on this mission for so long, because he just wants to go back to Coruscant. He wants to see all his other friends. He doesn't want to be stuck with Sol, a Wookiee, and his master. He doesn't want to be in this situation whatsoever. And so when Sol does come across these witches on this planet, he decides that, I'm going to go investigate all this stuff, because maybe these people are going to be the reason why this, life sprouted on this planet once again. They could be the reason why there is a vergence in the Force at this point in this planet. And when he goes there, he sees the daughters are being treated. What he sees them being treated negatively. He sees, the mother knock them down with the Force that we saw in the 3rd episode from a different perspective. And he thinks that these children are in danger because of the way that these witches are essentially, treating them, which I think is a very valid point if you see it out of context in the way that he does. Even though I think when you saw the perspectives of, Osha in that last episode, you get to see how Aniseya is a very loving mother. She has a lot of care for her children, even to a point where she is willing to let Osha go, to this other Jedi Order when everybody else doesn't want her to do that, so doesn't want her to let her daughter go. And so again, it is playing with that Rashomon type thing of, you're seeing these characters deal with the same situation out of context with each other. You're just not communicating with each other whatsoever. And what I think I really appreciate about this episode is the fact that, yeah, sure, you have different perspectives amongst the witches and amongst the Jedi, but even amongst the Jedi themselves, because Sol thinks that these children are in danger. You have Torbin just wants to get out of here, and if these children are a way to find a vergence in the Force, then he's going to go ahead and try to get them out, because they are the proof that they need to be able to go home back to Coruscant. Kelnacca is just there to be Kelnacca, to be a really cool Wookiee Jedi, which I'll get into him in a second. And the most interesting character I think in this episode is, Carrie-Anne Moss as Indara, who I think is a very great Jedi in terms of the perspective that you want to have as a Jedi, because yes, she does, consult the council, and the council says to not interfere with these people because they're just trying to live their lives, which is one of the fears that I had in the third episode, which is I was trying to theorize what could possibly have happened all those years ago to make, Torbin, drink the poison, to make these characters deserve these deaths that have been, planned for them by May and by Khmer and all this stuff. And so I was really worried at the fact that maybe these Jedi were sent to this planet to find these children, to recruit them, and to possibly wipe out this other group of Force users that are essentially a separate religion other than their own. I thought that would have been a super messed up thing to do, because then that would paint the Jedi as truly evil in this universe, because that is a really messed up thing to do if you have all these power in the galaxy, and the way you got this power is by wiping out all the competition. That is extremely bad. That is not good whatsoever. It explained, some of the things in the show so far, but I would have thought that would have been a bad direction, because it would have painted the Jedi as truly evil. But as the Jedi Council wanted, and as Indara, tried to say to Sol and to all these other characters, that we need to not interfere with these people and with their lives and with their fates, because if you do that, bad things can come out of that. And that's exactly what Sol does. He feels like these children are in danger. He feels this connection, this emotional connection to Osha for some reason. Maybe we'll explore that in the next episode, maybe we won't. I guess we'll see that. But either way, Sol really does mess up here. And along with Torbin, I think that he also is a character where when he found out that these children may have been, created by the Force, or created by these witches in an unnatural way, he thought, maybe they are the versions of the Force that we've been looking for. And immediately, without thinking whatsoever, he goes to encounter these witches because he just wants to go home. And there's even a sequence in this episode where you have Mother Aniseya and the scene where they first, introduce themselves to the witches as Jedi, and they said that they want to, test these girls to see if they are, Force sensitive, to see if they can be recruited by the Jedi. And you have that entire scene that we saw in episode 3 when, you had Aniseya take control of Torbin, and, you don't really get to see what was happening inside his mind when he was being controlled in that moment. So we get to see what happened there, and it's essentially Aniseya in this very interesting and hypnotic way, just getting into his mind and figuring out exactly what he wants to do. And I think this is also a mistake on the witch's behalf. If Aniseya didn't get inside his mind and threaten them in that way to try to prevent, these Jedi from taking her children away from her, I don't think that Torbin would have gone back to the witches to try to recruit these children once again, because, she planted the idea in his mind, even more so than it already was, that he really wants to get off of this planet, and he will do anything in order to complete his mission to get off of this planet. And I think that even pushed his motivations even more so to make the mistakes that he made. And it makes sense that he drank the poison, because again, if he didn't go back, then Sol wouldn't have followed him, and that wouldn't have led to the death of all these people, and to lead to the guilt that he feels with this entire situation. And one of my theories that I had going into this episode was that, obviously we set up the whole idea that these witches are able to control these characters in some sort of way with, controlling their mind. And so my theory was that, one of these witches, Koril, for instance, was going to, control Torbin to attack the witches, to be the one to instigate the fighting between these two sides, which would lead to all the witches being killed. I thought that would be the way that they started the fights, but that's not how the fight started. It's actually a very different thing, where when Sol and Torbin interact with these witches, and they're threatening each other, and Aniseya starts to do this weird power where she's going to control somebody, Sol decides to take out his lightsaber, and he kills Mother Aniseya right there, causing the fight to begin. So it did end up being his fault by being the first one to strike. It was a Jedi who started this fight to begin with, even though I guess Mother Aniseya was starting to use the spell to control one of these characters, so maybe it would have gone differently. But Sol is the one who did strike his lightsaber and to draw first blood in general in this entire instance. So I guess you can really pull at straws and really debate with people of who started this interaction, who made this all go down. Was it Torbin by going back there? Was it Mother Aniseya for controlling him in the first place? Who started this entire thing? I think both sides are to blame, which makes it again a more interesting story, because it's not black and white. It's not good and bad. It's these two groups of people misunderstanding each other, and even these groups within themselves misunderstanding each other, because Mother Koril had a different perspective, and Mother Aniseya had a different perspective on how to handle this situation, and Indara had a different perspective on how to handle this, and Sol had a different perspective on how to handle this. So it was very interesting in terms of the ideologies that these characters had that drove them to make these decisions. And so once Mother Aniseya was killed, of course, Koril freaked out and did the whole magic witch spell and controlled Kelnacca to attack the Jedi, which I think was an awesome scene. I do think that the choreography and the fight sequences in general in this episode, although they've been very few and far between in the series in general, I think it was great to see a Wookiee Jedi finally fight. I do think they shouldn't have, just killed him off screen earlier in the series, but to see him fight off against, Sol and Torbin in this was really intense. It was really cool. I want to see more Wookiee Jedis because this was awesome, and it's a damn shame that we didn't get to see more action like this. Along with, it's Carrie-Anne Moss's role in this series, which, when she was killed off in the first episode, I knew that they were going to have flashbacks, that we're going to see this character again, and she didn't really have too much of a role in the action in this episode, but I do think that her character was interesting in terms of her ideologies, and the fact that she made the decision at the very end after everything had gone down, and, once she, joined in and she got the witch out of, Kelnacca's head, and that was the thing that ended up killing all the witches, because once they severed that connection with their minds, I guess it just severed their connection in their brains entirely. I don't really know exactly how that worked, but that is how the rest of the witches died. It wasn't because of the fire, it is because, Indara, joined in at the very end and severed that connection, and so that's how everybody else collapsed at the very end of it. And maybe we'll find out if some of them did survive in the next episode. I highly doubt that, but in general, I think that she and her role that she had in that moment, caused her to decide to cover it up in the end by introducing the idea that May started a fire and caused all of this to go wrong. But if there was any singular thing in this episode that was surprising, obviously, I said that, the Jedi making mistakes and, causing this entire situation to happen was to be expected. There's a lot of stuff in here that was, fairly predictable, but I think the one moment that did actually surprise me the most is the fact that Sol was there, when May and Osha were on the bridges as it was collapsing, towards the end of this entire conflict, and he was there to hold the bridges up with the Force, trying to save both of them, but he made the decision, the active decision, to let go of May, to allow her to collapse so he can save Osha, because she was the one who wanted to become a Jedi. She was the one who he had an emotional connection to, just through the Force and just through this connection that he had, just, seeing the very little things that he saw out of context in this episode. And that is a crazy decision that this character made, and the fact that he is telling the story presumably to May on the ship at the end of the last episode, I don't know how May is going to react to that. I think that's probably the most interesting thing that has happened to May's character, because I do think that May's character has been very uninteresting so far, and I really think that maybe May and Osha are both going to turn evil against these Jedi at this point, and maybe both team up against, against Sol with Khmer, because honestly, I understand entirely why they would do that. And so to just put out my final predictions of this show for the finale, I do think that May is going to react very poorly to what Sol is about to tell her, because he literally was the one to let her fall. He was the one to, cause all this to happen in a lot of ways. His guilt in this show is very much warranted. I do think that if you were to go back to the beginning of the show and to watch it all now with the context that we got with this episode, that maybe the character decisions and maybe the arcs that the show has had, specifically with Sol's character, would make a little bit more sense. It would be a lot more engaging. I think that his character has been the one thing in the show has been the most consistent and the most interesting thus far. And, maybe now that we have learned some more things about May, and hopefully her reaction to the next episode makes sense and gives her some motivations finally in the last episode of this series, maybe then when you go back and watch it all, it would really work. But again, I do think that my main issue with this series as a whole is the fact that May and Osha's character were just held at such arm's length, and they're supposed to be the leads of this thing, and I just never really got a grasp of their characters, because all their motivations, specifically with May, was held as a secret this entire time. And of course, as Leslye Headland has said, that, maybe the show could get a potential second season. I know the viewership on the show has been extremely high, although the audience reaction has been very divisive for, some good reasons, for some bad reasons. I do think that this show has been a mixed bag overall, specifically when it came towards, the last half of the show, as things have been finally piecing together. I do think that the structure has really hindered the show's, flow and the show's pacing quite a bit. And so when you get to this, maybe we will get a second season following Khmer, May, and Osha. Maybe they will all survive against, Sol, keeping the identity and the secrecy of the Sith a secret. I don't think May and Osha are both going to make it out of this show alive. I think if anything, one of them will be killed. We'll go off with Khmer, and maybe we get a second season of the Acolyte where we actually get to see, the Sith perspective on this sort of timeline, and maybe we get some connections with Plagueis or Tenenbaum or whoever is the Sith at this point in the timeline. Maybe we'll get that stuff, but at this point, I do highly doubt that. There's also the music cues from, the sequel trilogy with Kylo Ren's theme that was in episode 5, and I feel like I heard a little bit of it in this episode as well, and I think they're just using the music. I honestly am very back and forth on the fact that, maybe Khmer is part of the Knights of Ren, as he is the Ren character that was in the comics, and maybe that line goes down all the way. I don't really know. They kind of tease that stuff, and Leslye Headland has said that it was on purpose. I really don't know where the episode is going to go with that side of the storyline. But again, this episode was purely just to, flesh out the backstory for all of it. And maybe I'll give the whole show a rewatch with all this context before the finale next week to really get a whole grasp on the bigger picture of this series in general. But like I said, it is a bit of a mixed bag. And I do think the structure of the show and the way the secrets were held and how it held back the character development of the show has severely hindered it for me, so I'm curious how it'll all play on rewatch. But those are just going to be my thoughts on the Acolyte episode 7. I do think Kogonada is a great director. Go watch his films. I love all his other films, specifically with Columbus and After Yang. Both those are great, and I do think he has an interesting perspective and direction on these flashback episodes, but I do think that the structure of the show really did hinder my enjoyment for a lot of this, so I'm very curious to hear if you guys feel the same way. Do you just straight up hate this show? Are you more mixed in the middle like I am? Or do you unapologetically love this thing? I really hope you do. I really hope you find enjoyment in this show, because for the majority of it, I was also feeling a lot of enjoyment for it, and I don't know how it's going to land with me by the very end of it, but I'm really curious to hear how you think it's going to land for yourselves in the comments down below. And if you did enjoy this review, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I, of course, have my reviews out for Maxine and Kinds of Kindness and Inside Out 2 and a whole bunch of other things. I'm going to be watching Longlegs this weekend. I cannot wait to watch that movie, and I'll have a full review for it later on this weekend. And like I said, leave a comment down below, leave a like, subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I hope to see you all in my next video.